Let's see where we at here. There we go. I never know with the webcam where it's going to be because it's never sitting on the computer. So, as we reach April, and I'm able to wear throw sleeve shirts. I did a lot of cleaning this morning, so, you know, I'm quite proud of myself. It doesn't show behind me because that's the couch, but I cleaned up a lot of that corner. Midnight's kind of pissed off because I found her areas she's been using instead of litter box. Anyways, so that was fun. So to treat myself, I got a newspaper, which is now way more money than it used to be. Newspapers are almost $2 now for a newspaper. And I got it because A, it's the NHL playoff preview, and also because it says, why do we care? If anybody has to ask why a Canucks fan would care, now, I'm going to make playoff predictions today, but I've cared for a long time. They mentioned in this newspaper as sort of a joke, 1989, Game 7, Calgary knocks Vancouver out. Joel Otto kicks the puck in overtime, and the game's over. I raged over that goal. I didn't watch it live because Game 7 overtimes, I can't watch. With the Canucks, I can't. I can with Boston. And that's why when people say, oh, you're a Boston fan more than a Canucks fan, no. I get so nervous in Game 7 overtime for the Canucks, I can barely breathe. I can't think. I just can't. When they knocked out Chicago in Game 7 in 2011, before the big cup run, and the riot which marred all that, my heart was in my throat. I watched because I knew this was a seminal moment for the Sedins and that core. I knew if they blow this 3-0 series lead and they lose Game 7 as well, that core is going to be gone. That core is getting traded out of town. They're gone. And Burroughs scored in overtime. And I've never cheered that loud in my life. I've never been happier as a fan than I was that night. And it really, it was slaying of some demons, but those demons are still there. And part of the reason is because Canucks fans have a major inferiority complex. Yes, Montreal's won 465 Stanley Cups. The last one they won was in 1993. And they haven't been close since 1993. They have a good shot this year. They have Carey Price. But honestly, I don't see them coming out of their division. There's no team in Canada that has any bragging rights whatsoever when it comes to Stanley Cup success right now. None. Oilers fans go, we won 5 Stanley Cups. Yeah, and you've missed the playoffs for 10 years. So that was a while ago. And of course, on the back, they have to talk about how they've gone from being on the verge of a Stanley Cup to being President's Trophy winners out in the first round to getting slaughtered by San Jose, being out of the playoffs, and then what's this year going to bring? Look, there's a long-term picture here. The Canucks have a good goalie for the future in Eddie Lack, who seems to actually like playing here. They're very lucky to have a goalie like Lack, and I think that's where Mike Gillis doesn't get credit. Mike Gillis signed a lot of good free agent players. Yes, he made a lot of mistakes, but his free agents have been pretty spot on. Tanev and Lack being the two big names right there. Cannons, who's come up this year and everybody's been excited about. That's another Mike Gillis signing. You have to give him credit if you're going to give him blame. And that's part of where the city gets messed up too. Roberto Luongo took so much blame for the Canucks' misfortunes, and he didn't get enough credit. No, he didn't win a Vezina. But trophies don't go to teams on the West Coast when the voters are on the East Coast, and when your West Coast games are being played, the East Coast guys are in bed. This is a standard practice. This is why guys for the Kings, the Sharks, the Ducks have got overlooked for years, while anybody who plays for a team in New York or Toronto or even a Florida team, you're going to get seen by the media who does the voting. I think voting is a popularity contest. I look at years Martin Brodeur won the Vezina. They had no right to be anywhere near it. And it's like, you know what? This is popularity contest. Nick Lidstrom, best defenseman in the league forever. Probably the best pure defenseman I've ever seen. Because Paul Coffey I kind of consider to be a forward defenseman. He's more of a rover than a defenseman. But did he deserve to be the absolute best defenseman every single year that Lidstrom won it? No. And I wouldn't be surprised if you asked Nick Lidstrom if he'd admit that. I think Lidstrom was the best all-around defenseman I've seen, but there were guys certain years that had fantastic years, but when the voting came around, they'd go, I still like Lidstrom better. And they were voting on his whole body of work rather than that season. So, when Luongo was here, the trophy thing was brought up a lot, and the scrutiny of game by game. You can't scrutinize a goaltender every single game. That's stupid. You don't do that with a forward, and you don't do that with a defenseman. But with a goaltender, for some reason, they're a lightning rod for criticism after every single game. And in Vancouver, it's brutal. It's insane. And in Toronto, it's getting brutal too. James Reimer, good young goaltender, and you listen to Leafs fans, and you think he's a terrible goaltender. Bernier didn't have a bad year, didn't have a great year. Had a horrible team in front of him. Clearly, he checked out after the trade deadline like everybody else did. And now I'm hearing, well, maybe Bernier's not a starter and maybe Toronto should trade him. For what, from where, and why? That's where the problem comes in. You make change just to make change. Today my Bruins did that. They fired the GM, Peter Chiarelli. Peter Chiarelli is the best GM that the Boston Bruins have had in 40 years, and the fact they fired him after missing the playoffs once has completely turned me around on my favorite player of all time, Cam Neely. I have a very hard time right now feeling bad for what's going to happen to the Bruins from here on, because Cam Neely made a mistake. Before the season started, the Bruins were over the salary cap. Chiarelli traded Johnny Boychuk, my absolute favorite Bruins defenseman, to the Islanders for draft picks, because he couldn't afford to take a salary back. The New York Islanders are in the playoffs right now. Why? A big part of the reason is because Johnny Boychuk and Nick Leddy of the Chicago Blackhawks came over from the Blackhawks and the Bruins teams that needed to get below the cap for nothing, for draft picks. The Islanders added players because they had a low salary, and it was exactly where they needed them on the blue line, and now they're in the playoffs and the Bruins are out. Now, you could say, well, Chiarelli mismanaged the cap. Okay. There are a couple signings I was curious about. Yeah, I probably would have got rid of Dennis Seidenberg before I got rid of Johnny Boychuk. But honestly, they won the Cup in 2011. They went back to the Stanley Cup Final in 2013. This is not a team that was on a downswing. This was a team that had an off year. They lost their number one center, David Krejci. The record without Krejci was really, really poor. As soon as Krejci came back, they started winning again. They rode Tuukka Rask into the ground. Tuukka Rask should have had more rest than he had. That has nothing to do with your general manager. That's your coach. I could totally understand firing Claude Julien. Claude Julien, I was calling for his firing back in 2011 before the Bruins won the Cup, because I didn't think he managed the team very well. I thought he was ruining Tyler Seguin, and I really didn't think he was managing the goaltenders very well. They beat Tampa, then they beat the Canucks, and everything was forgotten in Bruins land. That's where the problem has been in Boston, I believe, is with Julien, but that's me. Now, this year's playoffs. Now that I got that off my chest, this year's playoffs. I'll start with the Canucks series. They're against Calgary. This is going to go to 7. I believe this is going to go to 7. There's a lot of interesting storylines in this. I don't hate the Flames like I used to. I used to hate the Flames. Calgary was just the absolute worst. But I don't anymore. They're a good young team. I like a lot of the kids they have. I like that they got rid of Iginla and Kiprusoff and got better. I like that Sam Bennett is coming in, and they were already in the playoffs before Sam Bennett came in. Sam Bennett is a really good young player. I'm hoping he's not ready yet. As a Canucks fan, I'm hoping he's not ready and he gets overwhelmed pretty quick. And apparently Mason Raymond's not playing in Game 1, which baffles me because if there's anybody who's going to be fired up to play the Canucks, it'll be Mason Raymond in the playoffs. He should be ready to go. But I think the Canucks take this in 7. I do. I think Game 7 at home, I think the Canucks take it. I think the Canucks, the Sedins are really good playoff performers. I've heard a lot of bullshit over the years about the Sedins, and the number one bullshit thing I hear is, oh, they don't do well in the playoffs. No, they do fine in the playoffs. It's the fact that the Canucks have never had a support system. Go look at their stats. Go look at the Sedin stats. They've always had really good stats in the playoffs. It's not the Sedins. You don't see people in Pittsburgh going, oh, we need to trade this Crosby kid because I tell you, Crosby's been skunked in the playoffs for 3 years now. He sucks. We should get rid of him. No. It's because of the supporting team. When the supporters, your second, third, fourth line, when they're not scoring, and your first line is sputtering a little bit, you're not going to win. And that's what usually happens. Teams key on the Sedins. There's not anything else left. The Sedins will fight through and get some points. According to Canucks fans who are stupid, they're not getting enough points. So, yeah. I'm taking the Canucks in 7, and I think it'll be an entertaining series. I could definitely see Calgary winning this. I'm not saying it out of hatred. I think Calgary is a huge threat. I think this is the worst matchup the Canucks could have got, other than the Kings. If the Kings had gotten in, it would have been bad too. But that's that. And that's the only other team they could have played with, the Kings, or I guess the Sharks. But I would like the Sharks this year. I think the Canucks would have a really good shot at knocking the Sharks up this year. All right. That being said, let's get to Anaheim, Winnipeg. God, you listen to the Eastern media right now, and you would think Winnipeg is absolutely the Stanley Cup favorites. They're not. They're not. They're a good team. I honestly think they've overachieved, and all of Canada can throw tomatoes at me or rocks at me or whatever they want. I think the Jets have overachieved. I think they've done really well, and I think Andrei Pavlich has overachieved as well, and I think Anaheim will get to Pavlich quickly, and I think that series will be done in 5, and I think Anaheim moves on. I'm sorry. And reading the province, it looks like Vancouver writers are right in line with me. They're saying Winnipeg's got a lot of fire and a lot of fight, but Anaheim. Out of six writers, I think 5 of them picked Anaheim. And I'm like, yeah, that's about right. Whereas back east, it's all like, some of them are like, Jets are going to win the cup, and I'm like, what team have you been watching? You can get really caught up in this hype and this. Oh my God, they're great. They're not great. They're a good team that made the playoffs in a very tough year to make the playoffs. They're not great. Central Division, my least favorite of all the divisions. St. Louis plays Minnesota. I don't have any paper in front of me, so I'm just going by memory here. St. Louis is playing Minnesota. I'm taking Minnesota in 6 because Minnesota has a goaltender. And that's it. Other than that, there's very little to choose between these two teams. I hope Minnesota wins, only because I like to see St. Louis lose in the first round. And I think they'll fire their coach, and they'll be very frustrated, and it's basically been 45 years of frustration. I can handle misery as a Canucks fan, knowing St. Louis has been going through it longer than we have. And they haven't had the Stanley Cup runs that the Canucks have had. They haven't got close. They got close their first 2 years in the NHL and haven't got close since then. So I feel a little better. The other series, Chicago-Nashville. I hate Chicago. Apparently Patrick Kane's all ready for the playoffs. Isn't that super? So Chicago wins this series. I'm saying in 6, but it could be in 5. And because Nashville was on the downward trend in the second half of the season, they're a young team. They're very smart, but I think Philip Forsberg kind of hit the wall as a rookie, and you don't want to be counting on rookies too much in the playoffs. And I don't know how much scoring depth there is there to cushion Forsberg falling apart. So if Chicago runs Forsberg through the boards, and they're going to, Nashville, it could have a very, very short spring in the playoffs. They may have a very long spring on the golf course. So that's the West Coast. East Coast, you have the Rangers playing Pittsburgh. Everybody's taking the Rangers. I'm taking the Rangers. Some are saying in 4, some are in 5, some are saying it's laughable. I'm taking the Rangers in 6, and I think Pittsburgh, if I was going to say there's an upset special, I'd make Pittsburgh the upset special, but honestly, you have Crosby, you have Malkin, you have Letang, you have one hell of a good team here. Pittsburgh um, is a franchise that's kind of hard to figure out because they almost missed the playoffs. You got to wonder if they'd be cleaning house today if they'd missed the playoffs and not finished eighth. But Pittsburgh as a team could win it all. Anytime you have Crosby and Malkin, if those guys both get hot, nobody stops them. But I'm saying the Rangers will win it in 6. Washington and the Islanders. Oh, back in the 80s, I frigging hated the Islanders, and I loved Washington. I don't know why. I think it started with Pat Riggin was my favorite goalie in the mid-80s. And I liked Mike Liut, and Al Jensen was their goalie. I always went by goalies. Where my goalies went, that's usually the team I cheered for. Which was weird because I never played goalie when I played floor hockey. No way in hell. I think it was just, I envy the courage these guys have. I envy that. That's amazing. They have the courage to stand in front of a puck that's coming at them at 100 miles an hour and stop it with their face if they have to. So Washington was always one of my favorites, and Bob Mason was one of my favorite goalies, and Kelly Rudy beat him in overtime in that quadruple overtime game in 1987. I remember watching that game with my dad. I don't have a lot of really good, great memories of my father and I, but I do have good memories of us watching hockey together. Sometimes me teasing him when it was Montreal-Boston and Boston beat them. Sometimes good memories of us just watching a long overtime game. And we would just sit and just riveted to the TV. And then, you'd reach commercial breaks and, have something to eat, have a drink, and go back and start watching again. And then we'd talk during the game. It was funny, too, because I knew the players and the teams better than my dad did because I collected hockey cards and I read all the magazines and I read all the newspapers. I knew who everybody was. So my dad would be like, "Who's this kid?" And I'm like, "He was almost Rookie of the Year this year, Dad. You might want to pay attention because he's really good." And we had good conversations. So that was one area in which my relationship with my father was actually really good. I really can't complain. And it's weird because Noah and I have a really close relationship, but he doesn't like hockey. He doesn't watch it with me. There's been a couple of times where he's tried, and I've patted him on the back and said, "Bud, it's fine. Like, I know you're not into this. It's okay. You don't have to be into hockey because I am. It's fine." But yeah, so back to the Washington Islanders series because that reminds me of that long overtime game which I watched with Dad. But it's tough for me because I don't like Ovechkin. But I have to admit that 50-goal season he put together this year is damned impressive. Nobody can score goals this year, and Ovechkin puts in 53. I don't like him, but maybe this is the year that he casts off his Ovechchoke name that I've given him over the years. That being said, I'm taking the Islanders in 6 because it's Washington. It's like St. Louis. It's Washington. I can't see it. Behind Ovechkin, I don't see enough to make me say, yes, this team can do it. Their blue line relies a lot on guys like Orpik and Niskanen, who are big free agent signings who are slow. And I really don't know that Washington can overcome the Islanders' speed or the fact that the Islanders just seem to want it. Tavares, I think this is his coming out party. So I'm taking the Islanders in 6, which sets up the Islanders and the Rangers in the next round. And in the final division, we'll start with Tampa and Detroit. There's a hockey poll at work where you blindly poll teams who's going to win the Stanley Cup. And I pulled Tampa. And I'm very happy about that because they're one of probably the top 5 contenders. And in a wide open year, it could happen. I could win money. I'd be happy. I could easily be out in the first round, though. That being said, Detroit has major goaltending problems. Major. Tampa does not. As long as Bishop doesn't get hurt, Tampa is fine in the goal. And I'm taking Tampa in 6. I think every series pretty much is going to be tough, except Anaheim, Winnipeg. I really think that's a mismatch. But Tampa in 6 works for me. I think they're the better team. I think Steve Yzerman as GM of the Lightning going against his former team. I think he'll have his voice heard. He's not going to be as hands-on as Brendan Shanahan, who I think is, if possible, I think Shanahan's making the Leafs worse. And I didn't think that was possible. but I think he is. So Tampa, I would take Tampa at this stage in 6. So that leads us to Montreal and Ottawa, which I've saved for last for a reason. This is why I love hockey. All year, Montreal's been beating their chests. They've been the best. Montreal fans, excited, happy. Aren't we great? And trying to talk down to me as a Canucks fan, even though the Canucks were in the playoffs too, like, oh, look at Montreal. Yeah, they've proven nothing. Uh-huh. Yeah, look at Montreal. They went out west and played all the California teams, and they lost. Look at that. Look at Montreal. Every time they play a team that's really big and tough, they get slaughtered. Now it's the playoffs. And Montreal's battled and fought and kicked ass. And who did they get in the first round? Ottawa, the hottest team in the NHL. This is why I'm happy Boston didn't make it, because if Montreal played Boston, Boston would have lost. And then I would have had to hear, Montreal's better than Boston. But when Montreal lost in the second round, I would have heard, well, at least we're better than Boston. Well, we're better than Boston. Well, now you got Ottawa. And I'm taking the Senators, and I'm taking the Sens in 6, but I could see it in 5. I could be wrong. Carey Price could come out, steal the game tonight, steal the game on Friday, and they could roll to 4 straight. It could happen. Andrew Hammond hasn't been tested in a playoff atmosphere. He's only played 20-some games in the NHL, and it's very easy for a goalie to play very well until a team's got a book on him. And nobody's got a book on Hammond yet, because when they do, it gets ugly. I look at Blaine Locker in Boston. Jim Carey in Washington was another one. Vancouver, Corey Hirsch, that kind of happened with him too. Like, you have a goalie who comes in and he's hot as a rookie and he looks really good. Patrick Lalime in Ottawa. These guys come in and they're really good, and then a team figures it out. Felix Potvin in Toronto. You can't go by what a rookie goalie does and say, oh, this guy's going to be a star, because once the league figures out he's weak glove hand, all the pucks are going in that same spot. We've got the video replays of every goal in the NHL now. These guys can analyze. And all it takes is one player getting a fluke goal and going, that shouldn't have gone in. And then they go, there's his weakness. That spot in the net's his weakness. And if that happens to Hammond in this series, it's going to show. And it is ugly when it happens. It is ugly when it happens. I think I watched Boston do that to James Reimer back in 2012. Is it 2012? Or 2013, where I watched Boston taking Reimer apart. And Reimer might have a good game going, but as soon as Boston hit that one part of the net, he just couldn't stop the puck. And I remember Don Cherry like, oh, all goaltenders are weak in that spot. Most goals go in that spot. Look, I'm thinking, he consistently misses the puck there, Don. You're missing the point. It's not that goals don't go in there on other goalies. It's they consistently go in on him there. Whereas another goaltender, whether it was Luongo, Ryan Miller, whoever, is going to occasionally save those. Reimer always missed it. It got to the point where Boston would be going in over the blue line, and I would point at the part of the net and go, that's where they're shooting it. And then it would go in. And I felt bad for Reimer. That also speaks to your goaltending coach. Your goaltending coach is supposed to see those holes in a goaltender's game and fix them. So there's a lot of blame to go around. It's not just me picking on Reimer. I think Reimer's a really good goaltender who honestly needs to get out of Toronto really, really badly. I think Reimer and Bernier both need to get out of Toronto. I think everybody needs to just take the Maple Leafs and just close them down. Just take the Toronto Maple Leafs and close up shop and just move somewhere else. Because the whole team is a disaster. And I'm scared to death they're going to win the draft lottery on Saturday, draft Connor McDavid, and disaster him too. I'm scared to death that's going to happen. Because Toronto just wrecks everything they touch. You know, I think the Maple Leafs are the origin story for the phrase, this is why we can't have nice things. So, that shot at the Leafs being taken, This is a great playoff year. There were some really good teams who missed the playoffs. There were some really good teams who honestly should have made the playoffs and didn't, and that makes for a better playoff overall. I think this is going to be a very intense first round. I think the playoffs are going to be intense all the way through, though. I do. I think the playoffs are going to be really intense all the way through. So, I guess we'll see how right or wrong I am. Just as a side note, if you want to bet for every team I'm cheering against, and this works, there have been years where any team I'm cheering for loses in the first round, where by round 2 I'm done. If you want to bet on every team I'm cheering against, bet on Anaheim, Calgary, Chicago, St. Louis, Detroit, Montreal, Pittsburgh, and the Islanders. So there's your 8 teams. You bet on those 8 teams, you'll probably win. Because whoever I cheer for loses in the first round. And yeah, I'm cheering for Washington. I like Braden Holtby. Their goalie Braden Holtby is awesome. His body language during games, I'm telling you, when he's winning and when he's on, he rubs it in the other team's face so nicely and so well. And he's just great. He reminds me of Patrick Waugh that way. And I hated Patrick Waugh, but Holtby's cool. So yeah, should be fun, and now it's immortalized that I made these predictions before the 2015 Stanley Cup playoffs. We'll see how right or wrong I am.